and street races in the world. And Champ Car's been racing there for 22 years, and the cars are very sophisticated.
In the summer of 2008, in a quiet house in Westport, Connecticut, Paul Newman lay bedridden, his body succumbing to cancer. But instead of preparing a will or reflecting on his Hollywood career, he requested a tape recorder, an old Panasonic, to be placed beside him. He wasn't interested in telling his story to the public, but rather to leave behind a private confession, a record of 6 hidden loves, 6 men who shaped his inner world yet never saw the light of day. It was not a scandal he sought to create, but peace, one final moment of truth before passing. The first name he spoke into the recorder was Marlon Brando. Their relationship, filled with deep desire and emotional chaos, began in 1961 at a Beverly Hilton charity gala. Brando was disheveled and unpredictable. Paul, poised and reserved. Brando teased him with provocative charm, and Paul, usually guarded, didn't resist. Their connection grew. Coffee dates, nighttime strolls, and weekends in Palm Springs. Paul loved deeply, but Brando saw everything as a role to play. The worst betrayal came when Paul's private letters were leaked anonymously to a gossip columnist. Paul later discovered it was Brando who had passed him on, craving media attention. Even more painful was when Joanne, Paul's devoted wife, found a copy of one of those letters. Her quiet note said everything. "If you need refuge, I'm here. If you need another lie, I can't help you." What followed was an emotional winter in Connecticut, where Paul withdrew from the world. Reflecting years later, he admitted he had hoped his love would change Brando. But Brando, he said, used emotion like a weapon, and Paul was merely another tool for Brando's survival in the limelight. Then came Steve McQueen, a volatile and manipulative presence in Paul's life. They met in 1956 backstage at the Photoplay Awards. Paul, a family man, was drawn in by Steve's defiance and intensity. Their connection evolved into a toxic, secret relationship marked by domination and threats. When rumors about Steve's intimacy with another man surfaced, he quickly paired himself with actress Anne Margaret to quash the gossip, then forced Paul to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Steve even paid off journalists to silence stories about Paul. The worst betrayal came when Steve publicly mocked a fan obsessed with him, clearly referencing Paul. During a TV interview, Paul's pain boiled over in a confrontation on the set of The Towering Inferno in 1973, where Steve casually revealed he'd recorded every private moment between them. Paul retaliated quietly, sending Steve a box containing a torn, blood-stained shirt from a drunken night they'd spent together. Still, Paul admitted through tears, "I loved him. Even though I knew he could kill me, I kept going back." Following Steve was Robert Redford, perhaps the most tender of Paul's hidden loves, but also the most silent betrayal. They grew close during the filming of Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid in 1969. Despite both being married, a quiet romance bloomed between them. Their bond was visible to the crew, but never confirmed publicly. Paul hoped their secret love would eventually come into the light. But when he planned to speak to a journalist about it in 1976, Redford's team intervened, threatening Paul's reputation and career. Soon after, a smear campaign suggested Paul was emotionally unstable. Redford remained silent, letting Paul's name suffer in the press. When asked years later if he still spoke to Paul, Redford casually said, "We made something great, but everyone moves on." Paul was devastated. In a journal entry, he wrote, "He broke the part of me I wouldn't dare show the world without him." Next came James Dean, the tragic heart of Paul's early life. They met in 1955 on a studio lot. Paul was 30, James was 24. Their relationship was full of longing, subtle moments, and hidden tenderness. Afternoons in quiet diners, whispered lines in a remote cabin, drives to the hills in James's Porsche. One photo of them kissing in a parked car nearly ended both their careers when it inspired rumors in the press. James was dropped from major contracts. Paul was removed from film. A toxic culture of homophobia in Hollywood sent both men spiraling. James pulled away, leaving Paul isolated and desperate. A final message invited Paul to meet in Mexico, but fear and pressure held him back. James died in a car crash days later. Paul never forgave himself. He kept James's handkerchief in his drawer for the rest of his life. After James came Sal Mineo, a quiet, healing presence in Paul's broken world. They met in 1974 at a therapist's office in West Hollywood. Both men were worn down by secrecy and internalized shame. Their connection was gentle and restorative, free from the chaos of Paul's previous relationships. Sal once left a note in Paul's coat. "If they call you deformed, then I want to be deformed with you." They dreamed of a trip to Venice to write a film about love amidst sinking cities. But that dream never came true. In 1976, Sal was stabbed outside his apartment, possibly a hate crime. Paul was shattered. "He pulled me from the abyss," he said in a recording, "and I never got to say thank you." Finally, there was Montgomery Clift. Their love was quiet, but emotionally intense. Clift sent Paul letters full of vulnerability and longing, begging not for commitment, but for acknowledgement. Joanne discovered the letters in 1966 and left Paul. One of the notes leaked to the press, leading to public scandal. Studios pressured Paul to clarify rumors about extramarital affairs. Joanne moved out. Paul's career faltered, and Monty, already battling demons, tried to end his life. Though he survived, he never spoke to Paul again. Years later, when Monty died from a heart attack, Paul was broken. He'd lost his wife, his lover, and nearly his sanity. Diagnosed with emotional exhaustion and self-rejection, Paul was hospitalized under a false name. One therapist later wrote that Paul didn't want to live but didn't dare to die. Paul Newman's story isn't merely a record of forbidden relationships. It's a study in the unbearable contradiction between public adoration and private erasure. For decades, the world knew him as a devoted husband to Joan Woodward, a philanthropist, race car driver, and an Oscar-winning actor. Yet within the golden sheen of that image, Paul quietly carried heartbreaks that not only shattered his sense of self, but also redefined what love meant in a world where love between two men was punishable not by law, but by silence, exile, and annihilation of career. Throughout the recordings, Paul never positioned himself as a victim. He was painfully aware of his privilege, his charm, his fame, his wealth, and the respect he commanded from fans and peers alike. But that same success became a prison. He once whispered on tape, "I built a palace with no doors." It was a place where he could be admired but never truly known. And this duality haunted him to his final breath. In many ways, Paul's entanglement with Marlon Brando was the most complicated. Brando was a man of myth, a provocateur, and an enigma who made even vulnerability feel calculated. Brando didn't just perform on screen. He performed in life. For Paul, a man who loved with intention and sincerity, Brando's emotional slipperiness was devastating. Paul fell not only for Brando's charisma, but also for his tragic volatility. There were nights they spent under the stars in Topanga Canyon, sipping whiskey and reading poetry aloud. Paul thought he'd reached the core of a man the world couldn't pin down. But in time, he realized Brando's core was just another surface. What stung most wasn't the betrayal itself, leaking letters, manipulating narratives, but the realization that Brando had commodified Paul's affection. Paul described him as a man who could make you believe he loved you, just enough to use that belief as a stepping stone. There was pain in that, but also reluctant admiration. Brando didn't just survive Hollywood's machine, he fed on it. Paul, in contrast, felt devoured by it. Where Brando's manipulations were artful, Steve McQueen's were brutish. The affair with Steve was less about love and more about control, power, and proving dominance over a man as iconic as Paul. It started with smoldering stares backstage and evolved into secret rendezvous laced with tension, both sexual and psychological. Steve's jealousy bordered on obsession. He wanted Paul to himself, yet in public. Steve carefully curated the image of a macho rebel, publicly dating glamorous women. When his name was whispered alongside Paul's in the gossip columns, Steve reacted not with vulnerability, but with intimidation. "You have a daughter," Steve warned Paul. "Don't be weak. You know what they do to weak men." What haunted Paul most wasn't Steve's cruelty. It was how much he still craved Steve's touch. There were moments, stolen mornings after nights of violent arguments, when Steve would hold Paul's hand and whisper, "You're mine. You'll always be mine." Paul knew it wasn't love. He knew it was possession. But to a man who had to hide every soft part of himself, Even a warped form of intimacy felt like a lifeline. Paul never reported Steve, never fought back in the way tabloids might expect. He was too afraid of scandal, of losing Joanne, of shattering the mirage of the family man. That silence weighed on him. He used love like a weapon, Paul said, but I kept mistaking it for shelter. The relationship with Robert Redford was different in tone, but no less painful. With Redford, Paul felt understood, not manipulated, not feared, not consumed, but seen. Their chemistry on screen wasn't just acting. It was a thin veil for the genuine connection that pulsed between them. Yet Redford, perhaps more than Paul, feared the consequences of visibility. Despite their secret weekends in Aspen and handwritten notes hidden in script margins, Redford treated the affair like a beautiful, fragile dream he refused to let bloom. Paul kept waiting for the moment Robert would choose authenticity, even in a small gesture. That moment never came. Redford's silence following the planned New Yorker interview was deafening. He didn't defend Paul. He didn't deny the smear campaign. He simply walked away, erasing Paul not just from the headlines, but from his own public narrative. Paul, however, kept all of Robert's letters. In one, Redford had written, "If I could love you in the light the way I do in the dark, I would." Those words stayed with Paul for the rest of his life, not as comfort, but as an unhealed wound. With James Dean, the heartbreak was raw and unprocessed. Paul never stopped asking himself, what if I'd gotten on that plane to Mexico? Their relationship wasn't as long or tumultuous as the others, but it was the purest. Two young men terrified of the world, yet magnetically drawn to each other. James, unlike the others, never tried to weaponize Paul's affection. His tragedy was that he couldn't bear the societal pressure. The leaked photo of their kiss may not have made it to the front page, but it changed everything. Warner Brothers canceled contracts. Calls from agents turned cold. Paul tried to protect James, but James disappeared into silence, then into death. Paul's guilt never faded. Joanne once found him sitting in their darkened living room, murmuring, "I killed him," over and over. No one could convince him otherwise. The silver handkerchief James left behind, a relic of final weekend together, became Paul's most sacred item. He never told Joanne what it meant, but she always saw him touch it when he thought no one was watching. After years of emotional whiplash, Sal Mineo brought something different into Paul's life: peace. There was no chaos, no posturing, just a shared understanding between two men who'd endured similar scars. Their relationship wasn't defined by fiery passion, but by quiet rituals. Notes left in coat pockets, slow walks after therapy, shared silences that said more than words ever could. Sal was perhaps the only man Paul considered starting a new life with. Venice was a dream. Sal even wrote a treatment for a film set in the flooding city, about two men who find love as the world around them sinks. Paul never got to act in that film. Sal was killed before it could happen. Paul grieved Sal not with rage or guilt, but with profound sorrow. His death confirmed what Paul had feared all along, that love between men, even the gentlest kind, would always be punished in their world. The tragedy hardened him in ways he never fully reversed. Montgomery Clift was the last straw. Unlike the others, Monty didn't demand Paul's love. He only asked not to be erased. The letters Monty sent were hauntingly vulnerable, cries for visibility from a man who'd spent a lifetime being denied it. Paul tried to juggle the impossible: a crumbling marriage, a fading career, and a secret love that was imploding under the weight of its own invisibility. When Joanne found Monty's letter, she didn't yell. She just left. And when the letter was leaked to the press, Paul's world imploded. He lost everything in a matter of weeks: wife, lover, career stability, and self-respect. A hospital admission under a fake name followed. He paid top dollar to keep it from the press, but inside, he was falling apart. He called it the longest night of the soul. Monty tried to sever ties out of self-preservation. He couldn't endure the life of a secret any longer. Paul begged him to stay, to rebuild. But Monty refused, and years later, he died alone, his heart having given out before Hollywood ever did. Paul never recovered. What makes Paul Newman's story so haunting is a contrast between the life the world saw and the life he actually lived. He wasn't just hiding lovers. He was hiding grief, rage, fear, guilt, and above all, love. Real love. Messy, painful, beautiful love that could never find expression beyond locked doors and veiled metaphors. His wife Joanne, far from oblivious, was a silent pillar. She knew more than Paul ever gave her credit for. She didn't stay because she was deceived. She stayed because she saw how broken he was and how desperately he wanted to be whole. Their relationship was not a fraud. It was a sanctuary, a marriage filled with forgiveness, compassion, and quiet solidarity. At one point, Paul recorded, "She was the only person who didn't ask me to choose." Paul Newman died in September 2008, and the tapes were never made public. Whether they were destroyed, hidden, or simply forgotten remains a mystery. What's certain is that his confessions were not made for fame or forgiveness, but for remembrance. "I tell it," he said, "so as not be forgotten." Hollywood has long mythologized love, but has rarely made room for love like Paul's. What happens to men who can't live openly, even as the world worships them? What happens to legends who die with secrets that never got to breathe? Paul Newman's life answers that question. He loved deeply. He suffered privately. He was both the mask and the man. And in the end, he left behind not a scandal, but a silent plea. Remember the love, even if I couldn't. When the final recording ended, it wasn't with closure, but silence. These tapes were never released to the public, and the names, Brando, McQueen, Redford, Dean, Mineo, Clift, remained entombed in secrecy. Paul Newman lived a life of controlled appearances. The perfect husband, the model American man. But beneath the surface was a lifetime of love he was never allowed to name aloud. He once said, "I don't tell this to be forgiven. I tell it so as not be forgotten." And now, all that remains is a whisper on tape, a series of confessions made in the final days of a man who carried his heart in the shadows.